Presidents, Prime Minister, Ministers, Members of Parliament, friends. My name is Indrek Kannik and I'm the Director of the International Centre of Defence and Security. It's been a while since we last met in the framework of Lennart Meri Conference, almost 2.5 years. During that time, it's become common to see headlines in the media suggesting that the pandemic has changed the world forever. We will certainly discuss whether this is the case, and if so, to what extent and in what direction. But the pandemic has definitely left its mark on our conference. In 2020, we were forced to cancel it, and this year we had to move it from spring to autumn. As the saying goes, man plans, but God laughs. But meanwhile, we have tried to keep the spirit of the conference alive online. We have organized a series of discussions under the headline of the Lennart Meri Talks, all of which are, of course, available on our website. Many thanks to Toomas Hendrik Ilves, Jüri Luik, Kadri Liik, Carl Bildt, and everyone else who participated. Since the last conference, many events other than pandemic have changed the world around us. Let us recall just a few of them. At the end of May 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky took office as the new president of Ukraine. In the same year, the Hong Kong democracy movement rose and was quickly and brutally repressed by the Chinese government. In January 2020, a US drone killed Qasem Soleimani at the Baghdad airport, and the UK officially left the European Union. In February, the United States and the Taliban signed a peace agreement that led, last month, to withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan and the collapse of the Afghan government. In August, after Alexander Lukashenko's regime falsified the results of presidential elections, Belarus saw the biggest wave of protest in its history, followed by the biggest wave of repression. Also in August, the Russian regime poisoned the leading opposition politician Alexei Navalny, continuing a long path that started with the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko and Sergei Skripal. In the same month, the Abraham Accords were signed between the United States, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. Joe Biden was elected 46th President of the United States in November 2020. And in July 2021, the Belarusian regime launched a hybrid attack against Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, directing economic refugees from Iraqi Kurdistan to cross their borders. Most of these events have created new problems or deepened existing ones. Some have opened new opportunities. All these events have had not only local, but global impact. There is no hiding from the ripples and aftershocks of such events. Hence the theme of this year's Lennart Meri Conference, My Neighbour's Problem Today, Mine Tomorrow. Dear friends, as a young civil servant at the Estonian Foreign Ministry in the early 1990s, I had the privilege of working with Lennart Meri. There was much to learn from him, but one of the things I remember most clearly is his advice to cultivate an ability to differentiate between the important and less important events in the world politics, and then to react quickly to the important ones and forget the others. I cannot say whether I have been a good student, but I have tried. And I can at least pass on Lennart's wisdom to help guide discussion at our conference. Before I finish, I would like to thank all those who have contributed to the success of this conference. Lennart Meri's family, our partners in public and private sectors, our sponsors, colleagues at ICDS, and the director of the conference, Eva Ekpajuste. Without your efforts, we would not have been here today. Before I'll give the floor to the moderator of our opening panel, I have to read a couple of organizational announcements as well. Health and safety, of course, is important for us, and we work towards ensuring safety at the conference. Masks on the second floor are not compulsory, as it is controlled environment. If you do feel odd, then please do not come to the conference. Call the LMC team and we will try to help you. And please wear your badge at all times, including tonight's dinner. The moderator of the opening panel, Frank Gardner, needs no introduction to those who are watching BBC. And I'm sure in this audience, we all do. So, Frank, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Cheers. Well, this is brilliant being back here in person. This is called IRL, in real life, as opposed to virtual. So this is lovely to be here, to actually see human beings instead of a screen. It's lovely also to be back in Tallinn. I first came to Estonia in 1995, very soon after independence, when Tallinn was full of some rather large men getting out of cars, all speaking Russian, who I suspected were former Spetsnaz operators. It's fitting that we should be holding this conference today on the 82nd anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War, because as somebody who covers security for a living at BBC, I often have to deal with a certain amount of hyperbole and exaggeration. And the amount of times we have newspaper headlines in Britain saying, terror threat, worst it's ever been, etc. A few years ago, I went to an offsite run by Goldman Sachs, and their guest of honor was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who some of you may, well, actually, some of the older members may remember was President Carter's, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And he said, you know, all this talk about existential threats, he said, when I was national security advisor, I had to go in and brief the president that in a first strike, we should expect to lose 3 million Americans killed in the first 24 hours. That was a real security threat. So that's at one end of the extreme. But there's no question that we do face a huge amount of challenges, security challenges, and by we, I mean the entire planet. COVID, of course, has tested everybody in ways that we never expected, and it prompts the nasty question about possible bioterrorism. I'm not suggesting that COVID was an act of bioterrorism, but that it's given some people some ideas, and we'll be talking more about that later. Afghanistan, which is what's been occupying most of us since August the 15th, pretty much, since the Taliban walked into Kabul, has been a massive shock. And again, we'll be discussing that this afternoon. It's not just what's happened there and what it means for Afghanistan and its neighbors. It's the messages that it sends, both in terms of Western power and intervention, but also whether it's an encouragement to jihadists in other parts of the world, particularly in ungoverned or undergoverned spaces, like the Sahel, for example, in Mali, in Chad, in Mauritania, Niger, where people must be thinking, hang on, if they can do that in Afghanistan, maybe we can do that here. So it's a worry. Very conscious of where we are here in the Baltic states, and Russia hasn't, of course, gone away. The attention might have been on other things. But Russia, for NATO and all NATO countries, including yourselves, is clearly an ongoing concern, both in terms of cyber activity, but more geopolitically around the world. So when Russia sent its forces into Syria about 6 years ago, a lot of people, a lot of so-called experts were saying, it's going to be their Afghanistan, they'll regret it, they'll be going home in body bags. I would suggest that actually Russia going into Syria was a masterstroke for them. It's been a huge success. It's been an absolute demonstration marketplace for Russian weapons. It's put Russia right on the map in the Middle East. And Gulf Arab rulers who didn't particularly they didn't feel any great affinity to Moscow, they look at that and think, hang on, so America dropped Mubarak pretty damn quickly at the beginning of the Arab Spring, whereas Putin has stuck by this guy, Assad. So I wonder if, if there was another Arab Spring, would we be dropped? And it's really made people pause for thought, and there's a kind of grudging respect in parts of the Middle East for the way Russia has actually not exactly come out on top, but done quite well out of the Syrian situation, which of course is still horrendous. Terrorism was very much the focus, I think, of the 2010s. It probably reached its peak in Britain and in Europe around 2017. The destruction of the ISIS caliphate 2 years ago, or more, 2.5 years ago, has made it slightly safer, but the problem hasn't gone away. And you've only got to look at what happened in Auckland today. For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to check the news, somebody believed to be inspired by ISIS stabbed 6 people in Auckland in a supermarket today. That's in New Zealand, a country where, you know, that is not used to terrorism, although of course it did have the terrible attack in Christchurch. And then there is the other bigger things. China. What is China up to in the South China Sea? What is it up to in terms of expansion of its facilities? Having a base, for example, in Djibouti, thousands of miles away. Is it going to try and dominate the entire Indo-Pacific? Is it correct for the US to be making this great pivot towards there? Does that mean the US is going to be less interested in Europe? Certainly in the Middle East, from what we understand. So these are all themes that we're going to discuss today. And the format is that as soon as I shut up, the rest of the panel are going to come and join me here. We will start with your Prime Minister, and each of them is going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we will have a discussion, a panel discussion amongst ourselves, and then questions from you in the audience. And I know nobody likes to be the first person to ask the first question, but please don't be shy. I'm sure you've got really good questions. You've got some fantastic experts today. You've seen the program. So if I could ask the rest of the panel to please come up and join me here, followed by, starting with the Prime Minister. You go here, just pick yourselves wherever you want.
I'll go by the Prime Minister.
Why don't you?
You come.
Thanks. Prime Minister.
It's a great honor to be here. I've been in the audience several times, but never on the stage. So first time for me, and try to keep up. So as we are in Estonia, I would start with a reflection on our history. We just a few weeks ago celebrated our 30th anniversary of regaining independence. And why I talk about this is that I was a teenager at the time, and knowing what it means to not have freedom. So I personally don't take freedom for granted. So if they say that you only understand something that you don't have, I'm of the lucky generation that was of the time that you didn't have anything. So we regained our independence, and our President Lennart Meri worded our basic principle of our foreign policy, which is never alone again. Why I'm talking about this is that the theme or the topic of today is about our neighbors, about our allies, whether we understand the problems outside of our little world. And wording this basic principles, never alone again, means that we have learned from our history. And if we look at Europe, for example, then it seemed to us that prior to COVID, all these old friendships, or so to say, friendships or enemies that were not there anymore. So the French, the Germans, very friendly together, no conflict there. We had some signs. I was working in the European Parliament, and we saw that there were more national approaches everywhere. But what is wrong with being very national is that if you love your country, and everybody loves their country, but if it goes too far, then it might mean that you also, it builds upon hatred of your neighbors. If you love your country, you might say that we are better than our neighbors, and this is already dangerous. And of course, before COVID, we didn't have anything of that. But something was already building up. And then COVID came. So the first instinct that everybody had was to close up. And I think what we did correctly in Europe was that to see that this is not the way. So we cooperated when it comes to vaccines. For a small country like ours, we wouldn't have the vaccines if it wasn't for the procurement together. We also cooperated on the vaccine certificates. So we saw that it's not only us, we are not safe until everybody is safe. We are in this together. But more and more when we see the crisis in the world, the first instinct is to close up and protect ourselves. So being in this global world and also this pandemic has shown us that we can't live without the others. So we have to understand our neighbors, we have to listen to our neighbors, and we also have to understand their worries, because their worries might be our worries the next day. And very, I guess we get to talk about this is, of course, what is happening in Belarus and on the Lithuanian and Latvian border, which is very close to here. And we definitely understand that never alone again means also that we have to understand the worries of our neighbors, and we have to help them when they need help.
Thanks very much. Yascha.
Well, first of all, isn't it nice to be in a room with a lot of people and actually looking into real life faces rather than little Zoom screens? I have to say it's wonderful to be at a conference that is actually in person. I thank you for inviting us. It's also wonderful to be in Tallinn, which shamefully I'd never been to before. So when I got the invitation to this conference and this panel, first I sort of stumbled over the Latin and thought, do I try to recall my 4 years of school Latin? And that lasted about 20 seconds when I gave up. And when I looked at the English translation, there's been a few different translations in different iterations, but the one I remember is My Neighbor's Problem Today, Mine Tomorrow. And I thought, that's a nice aspiration. It is true about the world. That's a good start to a panel title. It's true. But are we living up to that? And are we closer to living up to that than we were a few years ago? And I fear that the last couple of years have shown us to what extent, both at a government level and at an individual level, we are ignoring the important lesson that is implied by the title of the panel. Starting with geopolitics, when you look at Afghanistan and the frankly shameful manner of the US withdrawal from that country, the way in which it has allowed the Taliban to very rapidly take over the country, the way in which it reneged on American commitments to the people in the country who had helped the United States, the way in which this is likely to have very adverse consequences regionally for India and other countries, internationally for countries beyond the region with refugee streams, and potentially for the United States and other countries in terms of terrorism. I think that is a prime example of an administration for which I had real hopes and for which I retain some hopes, ignoring the important lessons implied by the title of this panel, not realizing to what extent the problems today are going to be all of our problems tomorrow and perhaps already today. But there's also, I think, an individual level to this. When we don't think about geopolitics in Afghanistan, but we think about the other topic that has been in our minds for the last few weeks and the last couple of years, which is COVID. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a viral article called Cancel Everything. I was looking at the exploding number of cases, the exponential growth, and I realized that we had to take some really unprecedented action, which in my mind was shutting down offices, canceling mass events, canceling events like this one at that time, in order to deal with the spread of the virus. And that seemed to me the right steps to take, but it was in part the right steps to take because I trusted in the ability of the CDC in the United States to actually put a test, trace, and isolate regime into place. I trusted in the willingness of people to recognize that the neighbor's problem is going to be their problem and they need to actually stick to the rules. I trusted in our collective ability to use vaccines once they became available. And I'm frankly shocked by the extent of failure at every level, from the institutional level, from the deep failures of institutions like the CDC, to the social dysfunction, the unwillingness to wear masks where appropriate, the unwillingness to socially distance insofar as that made sense in order to make sure that we as a community as a whole don't all fall sick. And the unwillingness of so many people on all kinds of parts of the political spectrum from all kinds of different communities in different countries to take the vaccine that could actually defeat this virus. And I think that that has implications for how long this pandemic is going to last. It has implications for future and possibly more deadly viruses that we're likely to deal with in our lifetimes. But for me, it has really shaken my faith in the collective ability of many countries in the world, autocracies and democracies, but particularly the most developed democracies where I had higher hopes to actually deal with the big challenges we're going to be facing over the coming decades, not just in the realm of infectious disease, but also in the realm of climate change, also in the realm of any other kind of emergency that is likely to emerge over the next decades. And so I have to say, when I look at COVID on one end, and what that tells us about the state of the world, and I look at Afghanistan on the other end, and that tells us about the absence of America as a global guarantor and leader, it would be nice if we all recognized that my neighbor's problem is going to be mine tomorrow, but I fear we're in for a time in which is marked precisely by the lack of recognition of that, and that's going to make for a wild ride.
Thank you, Yascha. Margaritis.
Thank you, Frank. Good afternoon. There is no better place to discuss security than this place. Not only because Estonia is our union's digital tiger, digital champion, but also because this country is very much at the cross-section of an emerging threat landscape that should concern us all, not only the region. In fact, I was looking for a way to paraphrase the Horace quote, and I thought of something that Juncker used to say in his State of the Union speeches. He said that we either swim together in Europe or we sink individually. And when we discuss security, I think the European perspective of security is very much, goes very much around this central notion. 4 years ago, Emmanuel Macron gave this famous speech in Sorbonne on his view of the future of Europe. And he said this when he was describing the way Europe should develop in the future. He said that the key to Europe's success is l'Europe qui protège, a Europe that protects. So simple, but yet so true if you look what happened since. Because at the end of the day, what our people, what our societies want to have the assurance of being part of a union is that the union works for themselves. The union is a sort of a shield that protects them both from internal and external threats. In this emerging threat landscape, and I have the honor to have the responsibility in the current commission for the Europe that protects, I am quite meaningful of the 5 minutes slot that I was given. I would like to raise as introductory point 3 main families of issues. The first one, of course, being internal security, homeland security, as the Americans would say. The second being migration, and the third being autonomy. On the first, on internal security, we need to do better as Europeans, not only in fighting terrorism, international terrorism, working together to counter organized crime and money laundering. These are work streams on which Europe has been very active in the recent years. But now we have to prepare ourselves for the new types of threat, namely cyber, which is no longer a tech issue. Cyber is not something that has to do with the tech industry. Cyber is a national security concern. And as we saw in the United States with the Continental Pipeline and the ransomware, this is the world that is coming to us, a combination of digital threats that concern physical infrastructures and ransomware. In Europe now we're seeing this happening in the health sector, because the European health sector is an area where lots of data is available, and this will be the pattern in the years to come. We have put forward proposals since last November for a combination of defensive measures at the European scale, both for digital and physical protection of critical infrastructures. And we will hope that with the help of our member states and the security and intelligence establishments in our member states, we can do things better. Second, migration. We are seeing, since last year, a new type of threat, a new pattern. We see authoritarian leaders, neighbors, that they are trying to weaponize, instrumentalize human suffering and pain to harm Europe. And this will not happen. We saw it last year in the Greek-Turkish border in Evros. We saw it a few months ago in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta in northern Africa. We saw it a few weeks ago in the Lithuanian-Belarusian border, and I hope that we'll not see it as a result of the crisis of Afghanistan with smugglers or others attempting to weaponize human suffering to attack Europe. Let me say that in all of these cases, the ones who wanted to organize this against Europe failed. The Greeks protected the border. The Spaniards managed, and our Lithuanian partners are managing. So the positive message of all this is that when Europe comes under threat, then this reflex of doing things together works. The third point on autonomy. We did very well in the pandemic. And this European success has not been sufficiently told. The Prime Minister, who is one of our young European leaders, has the courage to say it. But this story has not yet been told. Europe is the most vaccinated continent on Earth. We have 70% of adult population on average vaccinated. We have issued more than 300 million certificates that saved a tourism season across Europe. We are bringing back mobility in an orderly and safe way. This means that yes, we can be autonomous and successful, not depend on others, provided that we organize on time and we do things intelligently together. This lesson of successful autonomy should also be an incentive to be more intelligently autonomous in other areas. And the other areas are, of course, foreign affairs, security, and defense. I know that in certain parts of our geography, including that part of European geography, this notion of autonomy is often misunderstood as being autonomous, being alone. No, on the contrary, we can, as Europeans, have a strategic autonomy. We can be able to provide security rather than ask for security, working with like-minded partners internationally, working within NATO, working with the American friends. So being autonomous does not mean being alone.
Thanks very much, Margaritis. Vikas.
Thank you, Frank. Let me also begin by saying how delighted I am to be in Tallinn and how honored to be a panelist at this opening session of this very important and timely conference. And I'm also, as the other panelists have already said, delighted to be in a room full of people A broadband line is about physics, but meetings are about chemistry. And I think in diplomacy, chemistry always trumps physics. Now, I do not know what the organizers were thinking when they were fleshing out the concepts and themes for this year's LMC. But I think nothing captures better the geopolitical and social upheaval currently underway in Afghanistan and its impact on the region and the world than the theme of this conference. My neighbor's problem today, mine tomorrow. As a neighbor of Afghanistan, let me make 4 broad points regarding the situation currently unfolding there. First, as Yascha has already said, I think the United States has erred grievously in the manner in which it decided to end its 20-year-old involvement in Afghanistan. Despite having over a year to plan, the US withdrawal was messy and chaotic, and as the horrific August 26 attack on Kabul airport showed, they could not even secure the security of their own troops. Now, I fully acknowledge the Americans could not have stayed engaged in Afghanistan forever. The issue is, why did they exit with just a minimum plausible deal, without any conditions, without even a ceasefire? What was the need to bypass the Afghan government in negotiations, erode the morale of its forces, and suddenly withdraw US contractors, which kept the Afghan Air Force flying? Even Donald Trump had not agreed on an unconditional retreat and surrender. So I think the humiliating manner in which the US had withdrawn from Afghanistan will jolt its allies and will greatly hurt American self-image of power, especially since its major rivals, China, Russia, and Iran, have emerged as the new power troika in Afghanistan, with Pakistan bang in the center. It is no surprise that these are the 4 embassies currently functioning in Kabul. Second, what does it mean for Afghanistan and for its 40 million people? Now, I don't know whether many people realize this. 65% of the population of Afghanistan is under the age of 20. The median age in Afghanistan is just 18. The younger generation of Afghans have no experience of living under the Taliban. They are used to media, they are used to social media, they are used to freely expressing themselves, to watching television serials, listening to music, to girls going to school, to women going to the workplace. Now suddenly, the Taliban are back in power in a 10-day blitzkrieg. And because they have come to power without any quid pro quos, without any power-sharing deal, they are not beholden to anyone except their mentors and handlers in Pakistan's ISI. And while they wish to be acknowledged and accepted as the ostensibly new and improved outfit that respects life and liberty, I think the jury is still out whether this is indeed a moderate Taliban, what we might call Taliban 2.0, or is it the same sadist, barbaric Taliban 1.0 minus Osama bin Laden? And let us not forget, it is the people of Afghanistan who will bear the brunt of the rule of the Taliban. And they already seem to have made up their minds in the horrific images we have seen of Kabul airport, where thousands of people of Afghanistan are jostling with each other to somehow get into the planes which are leaving Kabul. I think Afghanistan faces 3 major challenges. The first challenge is a political challenge. How do you bring together all the diverse ethnic groups of Afghanistan? Very few people know this, that Pashtuns make up only 42% of the Afghan population, which also includes 27% Tajiks, 9% Uzbeks, 9% Hazaras, 3% Turkmen, and hosts of other minorities, including Hindus and Sikhs. How do you accommodate their aspirations in an inclusive government? Then there is the humanitarian challenge, comprising up to 700,000 internally displaced people. And then finally, the economic crisis, which is only going to get worse with each passing day. Are the Taliban prepared to tackle these challenges? Only time will tell. Third, what does it mean for my country, India? We also heavily invested in the project to transform Afghanistan into a stable democracy. We provided over $3 billion worth of development assistance to Afghanistan. We had 550 projects going in all 34 provinces of Afghanistan, ranging from dams, to roads, to electricity lines, to even the parliament building of Afghanistan. So from the Indian perspective, the rise of the Taliban not only poses an internal security challenge, with large-scale radicalization as a first step, we are also worried that fighters from the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which have been fighting alongside the Taliban, may now be diverted to Jammu and Kashmir. So we will have to expand resources devoted to both defense and counterterrorism capabilities. And my final point, what does it mean for the region and the world? This is not a house on fire which will only burn the neighbors, because what is happening in Afghanistan will not remain in Afghanistan. I think radical Islamist groups, armed with the powerful narrative of driving out two superpowers, will challenge the American-led order in pretty much the entire Muslim world, from Iraq to Indonesia. I think Europe understood the importance of Afghanistan, and that is why Europe invested time and resources in the struggle to transform Afghanistan into a stable democracy. After all, much of the opium produced in Afghanistan ends up in the streets of Western Europe. And a bomb that is made in Afghanistan can as easily explode in Brussels or Berlin as it can in Bamiyan. So I think the entire international community has a vital stake in what happens in Afghanistan, and India and Estonia, both being members of the UN Security Council at the moment, I think have a special responsibility in ensuring that it remains stable, peaceful, and it does not become, once again, the global nursery of Islamic extremism.
Thanks very much, Vikas. I think you probably get the prize for being the gloomiest of all five of us here in your predictions, but I'm sure there's something to it. I mean, the speed of the collapse of the Afghan National Security Forces and the speed with which the Taliban took over the country took not only the West by surprise, it actually took the Taliban by surprise. So Mullah Baradar, who's their political chief and possibly the next head of government there, admitted that it was even faster than they thought. It prompted a lot of thinking, a lot of head scratching amongst other people, the way in which it's been done, following on from what Vikas said there. Particularly the fact that the White House decided they were going to do this their way with apparently very little consultation. So that brings you to my next question, which I would like to address to Prime Minister Kallas. When you see something like this incredible collapse and America going it alone on this, does that make a country like Estonia, with your huge big neighbor next door, does it make you question whether America would actually come to Estonia's aid if something went wrong?
Well, if I may, before I answer that question, I wanted to comment on what Margaritis said. Europe that protects. I think the theme or the topic of today just gives us the view that if we protect ourselves, might we raise some other problems? What I mean by this, if we have this clear view that Europe that protects, we have the food autonomy, we have this autonomy. But for example, when we talk about food autonomy, what it really means is that we protect and only buy from Europe, which means that, for example, African economies get a hit by this. And if they get a hit, then they have a problem with their jobs, with the people getting along, and where do they look or where do they turn? They go to find a better life. So if we are so keen on just protecting or having this protectionism in disguise when we talk about economy, then we actually might create problems, because our neighbors' problems today are our problems tomorrow. So just wanted to comment that we have to be careful there. Coming to your question, of course, this is a very tricky question and situation. But if we look back, then US gave us the warning already years ago. Trump said that they want to leave. Obama said that they want to leave. So why we went as NATO, why we went to Afghanistan was because US said Article 5. Article 5, and we have to get the terrorists. So when they got the terrorists, so their mission was eventually over. So we had the signs before, but I totally agree with you that the way this happened was fast. Now, coming to your question, how do we feel here? We still have a very strong belief in NATO, in deterrence and defense. And why I think the situation is different, because we are part of NATO. As President Biden said in the NATO summit, the only time when Article 5 has been used was because US asked this. So we have clear confidence and commitment from the US side. When we need this, US is by our side. And what is the difference, I think, between Afghanistan and Estonia in this regard, if I even may make this parallel? Then the difference is the political will to, to have this defense from NATO together with our defense and our army, and to build our country, to defend our country as it is. I think this is different when we look at what was happening in Afghanistan. So you can't really make the parallels, and we still are strong believers of NATO and in our allies.
Thank you. Margaritis, your country, I think, is one of those building a wall at the moment in case of refugees coming over. Do you think Europe is ready for a new, or put it another way, can Europe handle a new influx of refugees and migrants, particularly given what's happened in Afghanistan?
Just a word on the Europe that protects first, because I don't want to be misunderstood. We have in Europe about 35 million jobs depending on exports. So we are not naive to interpret the Europe that protects cause of Macron as being protectionist and shooting ourselves on the foot. I was using the term Europe that protects, as Macron did, precisely to craft this European shield against threats of internal security, cyber, hybrid threats, not as an excuse to build a world of protectionism in Europe, which we left behind us many years ago. Now, on migration, are we ready for a new 2015 type of situation? I would say we're in a better position than we were then. We have now a European Border and Coast Guard Agency, which is being built up very quickly. This will be the only EU agency with 10,000 permanent staff wearing uniforms, carrying the EU logo, having guns and their own equipment that we didn't have in 2015. We're also at the beginning of a new budgetary cycle. That means that we have more resources to be able to work with third countries of origin and transit than it was the case in 2015-16, where we were scratching the pit of the barrel to find ways of helping our neighbors. And yes, we're in a better position to have this reflex of defense against hybrid threats. Evros was a big success, Ceuta was a success, and Lithuania is becoming a success. That's all on the positive side. On the negative side, we have to have the courage to say that Europe, who has the world's biggest single market, accounts for 20% of the world GDP. We have the second world currency of reference. We still do not have a comprehensive EU migration and asylum policy. We do not. We have a patchwork of regulatory solutions which produce different outcomes, and we need a European framework. We have tabled proposals last September for what we call a new EU Pact for Migration and Asylum. I am a born optimist. I think that we are converging towards an agreement. We're not yet there. And I hope that with a new government in place in Germany in September, and after the French presidential election in May, Europe will finally tick that box as well.
Thank you. Now, the last time I came to Estonia, this country had just suffered a catastrophic cyber attack in 2007. It was something known as a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack. And you Estonians, I'm sure, will all know, but for the benefit of anybody else, essentially this was triggered by the government's decision at the time to move a Soviet Second World War memorial out of Tallinn to the outskirts of town because it was becoming a focus for a lot of protests. And the Kremlin had warned, don't move it. You're insulting our national history. You know, millions of Russians died in the Great Patriotic War. Don't do it. The government went ahead and moved it. And curiously, there was this sudden, terrible cyber attack because your country at the time in 2007 was one of the most digitally wired countries in the world. It basically swept away the Soviet legacy and decided to be absolutely online with as much as it could. So a distributed denial of service attack meant that your enemies at the time had activated botnets, robotic networks of zombified computers in several countries around the world, places like Vietnam, Peru, Egypt, even the United States. Whole arrays of computers were bombarding the president's website, telecoms, banking, and so on. And it basically brought Estonia to its knees until it was, so you had to switch off the internet from the outside world. I came here, I interviewed Yascha, who was your defense minister at the time. Estonia has since then become the center of excellence for NATO in cyber defense. So I want to turn now to Yascha, because you've done a lot, I think, on cyber and the manipulation of information. What keeps you awake at night? What's coming down the track that worries you most?
Well, I'm not at all an expert on cyber attacks or military elements of cyber, so I can't really speak to that. I think I have a concern that may be a little bit different from what you're imagining. I've seen the rise of this discourse of misinformation and disinformation over the last few years, and I think in part it refers to something very real that is in fact a concern. We have to make sure that foreign actors, and particularly foreign state actors, can't use our free public discourse in order to push misinformation campaigns in very concerted ways. And I think that there's clear regulations that we should have that limit, for example, the ability of foreign governments to buy political ads and other things within countries from Estonia to the United States in order to influence elections. We have to make sure that we don't essentially write a blank check for foreign governments to try and influence our democratic processes. And I think there can be clear regulations and energetic steps on that which don't in any meaningful way conflict with freedom of speech. At the same time, I also worry that this discourse of misinformation, disinformation has sort of zombified. And there's now a very fashionable way of referring to any opinion we don't like or any dissenting opinion from whatever the journalistic mainstream happens to be at any one moment as misinformation. And then the call rings out that we should go and censor misinformation and so on. I think we've seen that in parts of the pandemic in which theories which were considered beyond the pale, for example, about the origin of the virus, were very heavily censored by the mainstream media, by Facebook, by YouTube, with people, including Nobel Prizes, essentially being deplatformed. And some of those theories are now being taken very seriously at the highest level of intelligence in the US government, and suddenly the newspapers are writing about them again. So I think actually my concern is as much about the way in which the discourse of misinformation, disinformation justifies censorship, blinds us to important questions, silences dissenting opinions, as it is about the ability of foreign governments to influence our public discourse, which we have to deal with. But I think we can do that. I worry that the way in which a prevailing consensus has swung pretty explicitly in favor of censorship among journalists in many countries, among governing elites in many countries, is a very short-sighted betrayal of the founding values of our democracies.
Thank you. Do you know, I've just noticed this is the first panel I think I've ever been on where none of us are wearing glasses. Sorry, a completely irrelevant thought, but I just thought I'd throw that out there.
You have to go to some better panels.
Yeah.
We take this as a compliment.
Definitely, yes. It just shows what long sight we have. One area that we haven't really talked about today very much is China. And the enormous growth of its economic power, but also its fondness of surveillance, of intrusion into personal privacy. And Vikas, I was wondering, as a country that is very close to China up in the Himalayas, and that you're part of the Quad, the 4 countries that are trying to face up to Chinese power, what worries you about China today?
I think what worries us about China today is what worries the whole world about China today. It's that it's a new, very assertive China. Their model of how a state should work is very different from the model that Estonia follows, that India follows, that Britain follows, that the European Union follows. I mean, it's an authoritarian model, and it's a totalitarian model where it's a surveillance state. Everybody is all the time under surveillance. And they, because they have now come up with their Belt and Road Initiative, in which they have involved a lot of European countries as well. We have seen that, the 16+1 model, the 27+1 model that they are trying to promote. So I think what worries us about China is that will they continue to, expand their area of influence among other countries, and we have seen many dictatorships have been propped up by the Chinese directly, or we will have a counterpoint view, articulated by the United States, which unfortunately in the preceding few years was abdicating. When they walked out of the TPP, for instance, they left the Asia Pacific pretty much. So now with President Biden there, we hope that there will be a united stand taken against some of the practices of communist China, which are detrimental, I think, to world trade. The subsidy system, for instance, that they have, the trade distorting practices which they adopt, the stealing of intellectual property rights, etc. So I think these are the trends that worry us as much as they worry the rest of the world. But we have a bigger problem because we are the only country in the world with which China is locked in a military confrontation. In northern Ladakh, as you know, it started from last year. Previously, there was another one in Doklam, which took 73 days to resolve. This one has also been ongoing. There has been partly a de-escalation at one point, but we are still in talks with China to de-escalate at the other points. And our message to China is very clear. You cannot have a situation in the border where you're trying to unilaterally change the status quo and expect that there will be business as usual. I mean, China had become at one point our biggest trading partner, and the trade deficit had ballooned to $60 billion. That is thankfully now to $44 billion, but that's still quite a bit. But our message to China is very clear. If you will fire at us, we will fire back at you. We will not back down. Because we are also a civilization which is very proud of itself. We are also 1.4 billion people, and we believe that in a good world, both India and China can coexist. But if China feels that it will be the only power in that region, that is not something that we are going to accept or accept lying down.
Just to build on that, oh, sorry, Prime Minister.
Yes, actually wanted to make a few comments first on the information wars. I think it's even wider than that. Not only the censorship that comes with or came with the pandemic, but also, I mean, the fight of the values and the restrictions, giving away really. I mean, maybe giving away a bit in the rule of law and all the principles that we take for granted in order to restrict the pandemic. But when it's really over, then will we all take a step back? And I think this also shows the debate or the global power struggle between autocracies and democracies. So China as well, I think you mentioned UN Security Council where we are together, and we had a very high-level meeting in June regarding cybersecurity. And what was interesting about this was that all of the countries except Russia and China agreed that the rule of law also applies to cyberspace. And Russia and China are not part of that agreement. But saying that regarding Afghanistan, Russia and China are also pointing to the human rights situation and all these things that are the same for the Western world as well. So that was, I think, interesting for us. And I mean, seeing this, the problem with China and also the world as it is, the fight between democracies and autocracies on several levels. If it is, technological, we also have to keep that in mind, how this is working. And the economies of the autocracies are now, their GDPs right now higher than it is for the democracies. So I think we have to keep this in mind. And saying this, we actually have a very good summit coming this Monday and Tuesday in Tallinn Digital Summit regarding trusted connectivity. This is all about the same topic, how we, with the countries with the same values, like-minded countries can keep together and keep those challenges really in our head to fight for the future.
Thanks. Just before I throw it open to questions, I want to ask Yascha one more thing. Do you think that liberal democracies are on the back foot now? Are they in retreat, given that the incredibly bad PR that's emerged out of the Afghanistan debacle? The West intervened, not just the West, I mean, dozens of countries, including, of course, Estonia, which lost troops there. But also perhaps the triumph of those countries which were very strict about COVID and enforced, really strict rules with some limited success. Is liberal democracy on the back foot?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about the time when it seemed like liberal democracy was triumphant, and it's not that long ago that we all had that feeling, 20, even 10 years ago, it seemed clear that, not the whole world was democratic, not the whole world was going to be democratic, but democracy really was the only legitimate form of government that people aspired to in a serious way around the world. What were the conditions of that? I think there were sort of three elements of that, all of which, as our discussion has shown, are now in doubt in one way or another. The first was a kind of security guarantee and guarantee of a liberal international order. It was the role of the United States and some key European nations, India and other countries, in saying we are going to work together to make sure that there's certain rules that by and large we guarantee in the international sphere some protection of human rights, but also ensuring that countries don't get invaded and annexed, as now has happened in Crimea, and so on and so forth. The second element of it was actually relates to what the Prime Minister just said, which was first pointed out, if I may say so, by my colleague Roberta Fore and me in an article in Foreign Affairs, which is that for much of the history of democratic dominance, the cumulative GDP of liberal democracies was much higher than that of autocracies. And that had also to do with the American dream, the sort of what it looks like to aspire to live in a really affluent country, where the best universities in the world were, where the cultural products were coming from. And all of that is now changing in really important and rapid ways. When we wrote this Foreign Affairs article, I think 2.5 years ago, democracies and autocracies were essentially tied in terms of GDP. Now coming out of the pandemic, it's exactly right that autocracies are actually ahead because of the revised growth projections. But it's not only that. You have a whole area of China in the coastal region, which has about the population of the European Union and the same GDP as the European Union. When you look at the list of the top 250 universities, 5-10 years ago, every single one was in a liberal democracy, which I think 1 or 2 Singaporean universities thrown in there. At this point, there's a significant number of Chinese universities and other universities in authoritarian countries that are part of that. And so and then third is that there was a sense that democracies are the countries that can actually solve collective problems. That those are the countries that when a big global challenge arises, they are able to deal with it better than anybody else. That if there is a global pandemic, where do you want to be? Well, according to a study led by my university, Johns Hopkins University, and published in 2019, it would be the United States or the United Kingdom that you want to be in because those have the best public health response in the world. Well, Not sure that was right in retrospect, right? And so you take those three things together, as well as obviously my topic, the rise of authoritarian populism and the huge rise of polarization within democratic countries and the general sort of political dysfunction. And I think we have to earn, as democracies, the right to say, look at us, we are able to deal with our problems, we are able to promise our people a better and more worthwhile life. I think the principles of democracy still do that, and I deeply believe in them, but we can't just talk the talk, we have to walk the walk, and we haven't been doing very well at that over the last years, and that does worry me very much in the global competition between democracies and autocracies.
Thank you, Yascha. First question, gentleman over here in the yellow tie. Very smart tie, if I may say so.
And if I don't, that would not be to my credit. I'm James Scher. I'm Senior Fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at ICDS. So first, may I echo and reinforce Director Kanik's welcome to you. We're very pleased to see you. Congratulations that you've made it in these conditions. The last exchange we have had between Mr. Gardner and Professor Mounk has quite coincidentally framed my own question, which has been on my mind long before the latest events in Afghanistan. Would you comment upon, and if you would like, dispute the following paradox, that the global players that are the most single-minded and willful in advancing their own national interests, China and Russia, have proved remarkably astute and adept at grasping the forces at play in the world, at building the relationships wherever they can, and at understanding the interconnectedness of events. Whereas the two most significant players that have the most ecumenical outlook, namely the United States and European Union, have often been wrong-footed by world events, surprised by them,
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
inept. Yes, I'm ending it. At actually responding to them. Thank you.
Vikas, why don't you take this one?
Whether China and Russia have been more nimble-footed than the West?
I think that was your point.
I think that's the broad point. Well, I think it depends on region to region. As we were discussing earlier, in Syria, for instance, Russia played a much better hand than people gave it credit for. But I think at the same time, nobody can be said to be, completely infallible. I think missteps can happen all the time. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, what I would say is China and Russia are no great friends of the Taliban. But I think their underlying motive was the enemy's enemy is my friend. So I think that was the main thing. Let's get the United States out, then we'll cut our deal with the Taliban, and then we will take it from there. Now, whether this is a monster that's going to come back to bite them, in terms of if there is extremism happening in the Xinjiang region of China, if there is extremism and terrorism happening at the southern edge of Russia, I think that is something only time will tell. For the moment, their primary geopolitical objective was to get rid of the United States. The United States did it for themselves, and they are happy with that particular outcome.
Thanks, Vikas. Now, I can see 3 men have got their hands up, and not enough ladies are asking questions. So after the... President, please. Can we have a microphone up here, please? Thanks.
I heard the call for ladies to ask the question. Thank you. Very nice. We always, girls normally behave when they ask to. But I actually wanted to kind of come into this discussion and say that I do accept that democratic nations are bound by the democratic processes and its limitations. We've always known it. And therefore, Russia and China, who are not bound by these processes, who are not bound also by the fact that there will be change of power every few years and so on, have, you may call, certain advantages. But in the long end, these are not advantages as long as we recognize that we need also to have capabilities to protect our way of life. And in the long end, we always actually persevere. Why? Because we have our people with us. The difference is actually starkly demonstrated if you compare the war in Ukraine to what happened in Afghanistan. An unusual parallel, but it's new. It just happened in our world. Ukrainian people decided to fight. Their government followed. They fought. They are a proud nation fighting for the right to decide, for democracy. Afghanistan National Army, despite the fact that President Ghani told us all, and I think I was the last leader of a NATO country who talked to him, despite the fact that he tried to convince us that if you support us financially, and maybe talk also to some of our neighbors to contain their thinking, they will persevere in protecting their own wives and daughters. Yet this was untrue. You see the parallel?
I do.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that intervention. Margaritis.
Yes, actually, I would like to dispute this premise that the US and the EU were wrong-footed when it came to major strategic change, because the fall of communism and the fall of Berlin Wall and the fact that we managed to reconcile Europe's geography with Europe's history was a major success of the West. And that was a major strategic failure of Russia. And if one takes a macroscopic view, if such a term exists, of reality, I think we should be, as Europeans, collectively proud of what we managed to achieve. You know, this is not a small thing.
That was 89.
That was 89, yeah, okay. But there were. Do you think it's a small deal? It's a small deal?
No, I don't think it's a small deal. But I'm just saying that.
Your father wrote a book on that.
Yeah, true. But it's not a small deal. But what we have to understand is that the world is very dynamic, and the processes that are going on right now, we have to, address them and not to be relying on the past all the time, because we have Belarus, we have Ukraine, and I think what you brought Ukraine parallel here, the question is about Belarus as well, because there the people are fighting for democracies, but the power is not following, and why it's not following is because it still has the tools, and it has totally kept out the opposition. So there is no alternative. And if the people don't see that there is alternative, then, or not the people, but the power structures don't see the alternative, then there will not be the change. But I agree with you that the difference is the political will of the people still. I mean, if you make the parallel.
I'm getting a little worried about the state of Greek-Estonian relations here, but I just want to point out about the debate with Russia and China that I think there is an important difference between what the goal of a power is. And I think one of the reasons why it can often look like China and particularly Russia are more nimble is that the European Union and the United States are trying to provide political order and rules. And that's a very hard thing to do. What particularly Russia is trying to do is to disrupt. And that's a much easier thing to do. So I don't think there's a great paradox in why they appear to be more nimble, because they're willing to take any opportunity to disrupt, and that's an inherently easier task. I don't think they've succeeded at the systemic level yet, but they can do a lot of damage in that way.
Let's take the next question. Gentleman here.
Thank you. Charlie Sloanius Pasternak, Finnish Institute of International Affairs. We've talked about neighbors who are democratic and authoritarian states. How do you think large global companies, tech or not, view the neighborhood, or even who their neighbors are? Do they care?
Vikas. Oh dear. Shaking head.
On big companies. I mean.
Yascha.
Who are well, it is a very good question in a sense that who are the neighbors if you are operating in digital sphere, for example. But I think that there is a difference how some companies that come from the democracies operate and how they see the world and what kind of tools they use versus the companies that come from those countries that don't respect the rule of law, for example. But it's a very interesting question. Don't have the definite answer for that. Have to think.
Gentleman over here with raising his hand.
Thank you, Frank. Steve Erlanger, New York Times. Nice
Hello.
to, nice
Sorry,
to see
did you
you all.
recognize him?
No.
There's
I'm
me
not
thinking I
wearing
had
my
good eyesight.
glasses. I'm not going to ask about Afghanistan. I think we're going to have a lot of that. And I would ask Margaritis not to answer first this question because he's a professional spokesman in the past. But when we speak about Europe and migration, you talk about the Europe qui protège. Others say the Europe qui recule, the Europe that's pulling back, the Europe that's cowering, the Europe that wants to protect itself from the world. And migration is a good issue because on the one hand, people speak about how terrible it is in Afghanistan and how we have to help the Afghans. And in the next breath say, but not us. We'll pay Pakistan, we'll pay Iran, we'll pay Turkey, we'll pay anybody. Just keep them away from us because we're afraid of them and our politics can't deal with it. So that's what I want to ask about, and I will stop there.
I'm going to ask Yascha to...
Well, look, I'm going to try and take value judgments out of this and just make an empirical statement. You know, in 2015, there was a strong strand of l'Europe qui protège. There was obviously an attempt to say we have a humanitarian obligation towards victims of civil war in Syria and other places. The result was, in part, the rise of right-wing populist parties in many countries in Western Europe where they had not previously been strong. At least a phase of deep unpopularity of many of the governments, a fall of a good number of governments, a real social mobilization at the beginning to welcome the refugees and some really impressive civil society action, but then quite quickly to protest the result of these policies. And I think despite a lot of highfalutin rhetoric, you see across the political spectrum of virtually every member state of the European Union a very clear determination not to let 2015 happen again. I was watching the candidate duel, triel, they call it in German, which is a weird phrase, the three candidates debate in the German elections last Sunday. It was quite clear that they did not want 2015 to happen again. And so when I'm asked, for example, on panels that touch on climate change, my God, climate change is going to bring so many migrants to Europe. What effect is that going to have? I think it's a category mistake. There's already a lot of people who would like to come to Europe, and Europe has quite clearly made its decisions to close its borders at whatever price, including deals with authoritarian powers and so on. And I don't think, for all of the terrible things that the Afghanistan crisis will do to the world, it will not lead to a repeat of 2015 because the political will is there to make sure it doesn't.
Okay, lady to your
Can
right.
I still reply as a, not as a spokes, but
Could you pass the...
Frankie won't give it the floor, Stephen, to reply to.
Frank is ignoring you in a very skilled manner.
No, but what I simply wanted to say, Frank allows me, is that Europe will always remain an asylum destination. This is what defines us. This is why we are European. Everyone who flees dictatorship, harassment, should know that Europe would be there. But at the same time, Europe will defend our external border against hybrid threats and weaponization. And this will happen. And this is not antithetic with being an asylum destination. It's one thing that we would allow someone to file for asylum in Europe, and it's another thing that we will do nothing when 20,000 desperate people are put in buses in Istanbul and they are sent to the Greek-Turkish border in an afternoon saying, okay, you say everything is free now, the road is free, you can be in Berlin tomorrow morning. And same thing in Belarus, or same thing in Ceuta. So I don't see, Stephen, an antithesis between an Europe qui protège and a Europe which is not naive.
Prime Minister.
Just a small comment. This is, I think, the same for most of the European countries. It is that we learned from the crisis that we had 2014, 2015. And you know, the political situation in many countries has changed so that the rise of nationalism, the rise of far-right parties, this is the pressure that comes. And it is based on fears. So I can talk about Estonia. So we don't have many foreigners here. And when you go outside Tallinn, then people have fears. And fear is too strong emotion to say that don't be afraid. You just are afraid. And I think all the governments have to deal with those fears. So it is much easier for politically in every country to explain that we try to help those people where they are, so that we can't help them all here. This is just the situation that it is, and I think it's the same probably elsewhere as well.
Thanks. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. It was very interesting continuation. Hannah Shallist, Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. And my question was exactly to the Vice President Schinas, so you would have a word, even if they didn't allow in the beginning. Prime Minister been talking about the rise of the individual countries' nationalism in Europe recently. But what do you think about the trend that we are seeing as neighbors, that it is also the rise of the European Union nationalism, if you can name it like this, especially during the pandemic, with the traveling bans, with the restrictions that being imposed, with the closing of the European Union for others, even for the Eastern Partnership countries. But it's not only for traveling, but also in the energy security issues, and also in the questions of the reviewing of the association agreements with these three countries and the idea of development. So it seems to me that now, except of individual, we as neighbors also see that the last 3 or 4 years, it is quite a negative trend of the European Union nationalism regarding the neighbors.
Margaret.
If I may, two different things there. First of all, I think you're absolutely right when you say that in the first weeks of the pandemic, our governments, our member states reacted very much as individuals did. Individuals stormed the supermarkets, they bought pasta and toilet paper, thinking that that would be enough to cope against the virus. And member states did more or less the same. They closed borders, they started competing with each other for masks and ventilators, and they thought that would be okay. It took 4 weeks for this nationalism to die, because I should not speak about member states as they, we in the European Union understood the interdependence of our supply chains, the might of our single market, the added value of working together. And then it all started working together on vaccines, therapeutics, ventilators, certificates, so on and so forth. Now, that's one thing. The second thing on neighbors. I do not quite agree that the European Union is reviewing our strategic relations with neighbors. I would say that the European Union remains the biggest investor in all our neighborhood, the Western Balkans, in Eastern Partnership countries. But there is a difference, that with our money, with EU taxpayer money, we build infrastructure, we build sewage, we build green infrastructure, and our competitors with far less money, they buy radio stations, football clubs, and they build churches or mosques.
Margaritis, we're running very short of time, so I'm going to cut you off there, I'm afraid, with respect. Yascha, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just want to say, I think there was nationalism in the response to the pandemic within the European Union, and some of that was bad. The biggest failing was the opposite. The biggest foiling was the absolutely disastrous European Union-led process of the acquisition of the vaccines, in which instead of actually the political pressure of a national government trying to procure a lot of vaccines for their own people, you had a very bureaucratic process which negotiated over needless things, managed to keep the price per shot down by a few euros compared to what the United States paid, but actually resulted in months of lost time when the United States was vaccinating a lot of its people and Europeans didn't have access to the vaccine. I got vaccinated 3 months before my mother, who was in Europe. That was a shameful failing of the European Union, which has been under-discussed in the European public. So, I'm a fan of the European Union in many ways, but you should also look at the other dangers sometimes.
I must let Margaritis respond. No, okay.
No, yeah. Sorry to dispute this argument. That's not true, because the vaccines is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And we had a low start, that's clear, because one of our providers failed to honor their contractual obligations. But look where we are now. We are in a better position than any other continent in the world. And that is a European success no one can take away from us.
Prime Minister.
Just wanted to answer the European nationalism question. It is true that Europe tried to close up, and I think what you have to understand is that there was an interesting study that for young Europeans, the value of European Union is the free movement of people. So, and when we had the pandemic, we actually had borders again in the European Union. So we can travel freely, which meant that this was something that was attacked. So it's very easy to say that, the threat comes from outside. So let's close the borders for the European Union so we can preserve our way of life. But we know that this pandemic doesn't know borders. So actually, eventually, it doesn't really work.
Very quickly, final question from the British ambassador. Better be a good one.
No pressure.
It absolutely will be. Ross Allen, British Ambassador to Estonia. President Biden is hosting a summit for democracies in December. Relates to this theme of democracies and autocracy. So could the panelists just say if there's one practical thing they'd like to see come out of that summit? Thank you.
First of all, I come back to the Tallinn Digital Summit that comes this Monday and Tuesday. Why? Because we actually try to sort of put together all the initiatives that are there in the world. And for us, we have a moral high ground by being a small country. So nobody is really thinking that we try to take over some other country. So we might put together all the initiatives that there are regarding democracies, investing in infrastructure, digital elements to it. So we try to build the Tallinn consensus on this and then go to the Democracy Summit because they don't have the ideas yet, so we can give the ideas.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, so I'm going to ask each of the panel to give their just very brief takeaway from this session. So my apologies to those who put their hands up and I didn't get round to them. You can come and beat me up later, but go easy because I'm in a wheelchair. Vikas.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. I think the big takeaway that I got from this panel was the deep investment that the entire world feels in what's happening in Afghanistan. I think you raised it first, Yascha said it, the Prime Minister said it, and of course, our colleague from the European Union said it. I think everybody has a big stake in what's happening in Afghanistan. Leonard Merry, one of his favorite quotes was that he said that history is more interesting than politics. And I think one of the big lessons of history is that it repeats itself. If we do not want a repeat of what happened in Afghanistan in 2001, if we want to preserve the gains that were made over the last 20 years for women's rights, for education, for democracy, then I think it's important that the international community, the entire international community, holds the Taliban accountable for what they are going to do in Afghanistan. India and Estonia are both in the Security Council. 3 days ago, we issued a very strong presidential statement from the Security Council, where we were the chair of the Security Council, in which we said that Afghanistan should not be used as a staging ground for launching attacks on any of its neighbors. Afghans who want to leave should be allowed to leave, and an inclusive government should be formed with the full participation of women.
Great.
I think these are objectives that we must stick to.
Thank you, Vikas. Yascha.
my first lesson from his panels, but I never want to speak after Vikas because he's a hard act to follow. But I think for me it is the sense of a lack of orientation that democracies in particular have around the world. And, you know, I started making this argument around 2015, 2016, when the nature of that threat was right-wing populism, some left-wing populism, you know, people like Donald Trump and so on and so forth. But now Donald Trump has thankfully gone from the stage, but we see that we don't really have that much more collective self-confidence, a little more competent government, but not always as competent as we would like.
Yascha,
Still no.
What's your takeaway there? What's the message you want people to have?
Well, I think
we're being a bit vague here.
We're okay. You want less vague? We're in deep shit. Is that clear enough?
Okay, that works. Margaritis.
Well, my takeaway is that, as you probably would have understood by now, I'm against this well-known European pathology of self-flagellation. This is very European. We are always like taking it from the negative side. What I want to say is that our systems proved much more resilient under threat than many would have expected. Unprecedented times, our societies, the cohesion, we took care of each other, our health systems, our education systems coped. We were much closer together than one would have thought. And I think that's the essence of the European way of life. And we should keep it that way.
Prime Minister, last word.
Yeah, my very short takeaway is that we have to keep in mind that by protecting ourselves, we might be hurting our neighbors. So we have to find the right balance that, you know, by doing this, we actually don't have our problems tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks. President, did you want to? Right. Thank you so much, all of you, for your attention, and particularly thanks to this incredible panel we've got here. Thank you very much.